So rather than trying to glue all of this with a nozzle that's maybe too large, I'm going to instead apply my glue with a brayer. So onto a resistant mat, something that's going to protect my surface, I'm going to apply a little bit of wet glue. This is a glue that I would use for sticking die cuts down. And I'm going to take a brayer and just roll that into the glue so it's a nice thin layer. Then I'm going to brayer this all over the reverse of the die cut. I can now go ahead and apply that to my project wherever I want it, and as you can see, everything is stuck down. So this card has been stuck down with a double-sided tape, and this card has got layers stuck down with foam pads or foam tape. It's all very similar, and I'm going to release both of these. Now these cards were actually made months ago, so in theory they should be well stuck by now and not coming off, but I'm simply going to use a heat tool. Obviously be aware if you've got any heat embossing on your card or your project that you could remelt that embossing while doing this technique. So I'm simply going to start off with my heat gun behind my card on the reverse from where the adhesive is. This way I'm not heating the front of my card and causing any damage to the inking and the embossing that's on here. And as you can see already, this is starting to peel away. Once one corner has started to lift, you can just tease that. Then you can take your heat gun and you can put it underneath. And now my card base is separated from the front. So this could be for multiple reasons, but either way, you can then restick this or throw it and reuse your card base. And exactly the same applies when you're doing this with a foam tape too. So again, heating from the reverse, I'm just going to warm this up until I see that start to lift and I can get the heat gun underneath there a little bit more. As you can see, there's no residue left on the cardstock either. So it's all about your hot glue gun. Now, how many people are scared of using a hot glue gun? Because of course you can burn your fingers, you know, it can leave the glue strings. It's not always perfect. So what I tend to do is take my hot glue gun, heat it up, get myself a silicone mat, and I just pop myself some glue drops on my mat. So I do this about once a month, and I just get myself maybe 20 or 30 glue drops. It takes me just a few minutes, and then I pop them aside to dry. Once the glue drops have cooled down, you can just pop them off the silicone mat and store them away. Now I tend to come to these when I need just the tiniest little drop of glue. I don't need to worry about waiting for my glue gun to heat up. Plus, it's a lot safer and a lot easier. All you need to do is take the appropriate size glue dot, because of course you can make these small and large. Pop it where you'd like to use a glue drop. So this is usually for my heavier and different materialed embellishments like this wooden star. And rather than using my hot glue and putting the star directly in it while it's still warm and rushing, I can be careful to position that exactly where I want it, and then gently just warm it with my heat gun, which of course is instant heat. And as soon as that's gone transparent, I can put my embellishment into it. Now I have got absolutely no glue strings, and that is instantly adhered. It's about foiling without a foiling machine. This is the Magnolia half-tone stamp and die set. I love it, but I'd love the look of it foiled. So I've cut it out and I'm going to put it onto a dark cardstock so you can really see. But you may be thinking, well, that's not really a tip. That's just gluing a foiled piece of cardstock onto another piece, because that wasn't the tip. This is how to make it look like foiling. Now you'll notice that with the glued on die cut, we've got this raised area, so it looks like it's glued on. Now with real foiling, that would be completely smooth to the surface of the cardstock, and that's what we're going to do. So we're going to bring in our die cutting machine, and I'm going to place a rubber mat onto the base plate of my machine. This is a thin rubber mat, so it's one that is going to go through in the die cutting sandwich without having to take any other plates out. Then I'm going to place my piece of foiled cardstock, or not yet, almost foiled, onto the die cutting plate there, onto the rubber mat with the design facing upwards. Put my top plate on and run this through. There's no die in here. So what this is doing is adding pressure to the design, and it's pressing that mirror card design, the die cut, into the cardstock and flattening it out. So now we've got something that looks more like foiling.
Now, all dies you can usually emboss with. If they are the dies where you have to snip elements out of each other, they're not as easy until you've done the snipping. But nesting dies are perfect. Now you can use any shape or size of nesting die and any amount of them that you want. Just lay down a rubber mat in your plates or your sandwich, put your cardstock down, then your nesting dies with the dies facing downwards, and then your plate on top. And you have got subtle texture that you can use in the background of a card or just to subtly frame something on your card. So this is the result of cutting this die in the normal way through my die cutting machine. The cardstock is around about 220 GSM, so it should be perfect for die cutting. Some of the elements I can probably pop away, but certainly in the middle here, there's absolutely nothing cut through whatsoever. I haven't put any shims with this. I've not gone through multiple times or anything like that because I want to see if this hack makes a difference, and it's actually a really easy one. I don't know how it would work if it's going to, but somebody said to use bubble wrap. So in the spirit of keeping everything fair, I have got the other half of this cardstock, so I'm using the same cardstock to run through, the same die as well. I'm going to open this up now. I cut this one with my die facing up, and this is actually one of my tips for you anyway. So putting the die on the plate first, then the cardstock on top, like so. Now, from what I understand, this tip says to then put your bubble wrap or jiffy bag over the top of that, so it's almost cutting into the jiffy bag as well. So let's first of all see. Well, I think it's actually, it has, wow. I mean, there's a little bit here that's still not quite cut through, just there, and the same just here. But that has made a huge difference. So I put this in the machine the same way and the same cardstock as this one. So I've just die cut this butterfly, and I'm going to use this waste here to stencil the colour that I want through. You can of course use your colouring pencils, your alcohol pens, whatever it is you prefer to colour with, but we're just using this as a silhouette to brush some ink through. And we have now got the perfect coloured outline for our die cut to sit over the top of. How beautiful is that? So when you've die cut something that's really intricate, you know you're going to pull that die cut out and you're going to have all the little bits that you've got to use your pokey tool with to pop out, and it's going to take you forever. Use this quick trick to make sure that as many of the pieces stay inside the die, because it's so much easier to clean the die than the paper die cut. So once I've put my pokey tool through one of the release holes and just released a corner, I tend to very gently take this out and bend it backwards. Okay, so I'm not going to just pull the whole thing really quickly. I'm going to bend it backwards on itself. You can see that. So what this does is leaves as much of the paper of the little die cuts inside the die. Now, not everything's going to stay in the die, but many of the pieces will, as you can see there. This just means if you are creating a project, it is so much quicker for you to then clean up your die later. And this is almost perfect. There's a couple of little bits that I need to clean out, but that is going to take me so much less time. Now, as for actually cleaning my die, a brush like this is perfect, even an old toothbrush if you have it. And what I tend to do is slightly bend my die. So I'll place it down, lift up the edge with my thumb in the middle. So I'm giving it a slight curve, not enough to bend it permanently at all, a slight curve. And then I brush over. And as you can see, all the pieces come out so quick and easily. That is by far the quickest way for you to clean the pieces out of your dies and your die cuts. You're layering die cuts. Now, when you layer your die cuts together, you're going to get absolutely beautiful results. But how can you improve this even more? It's very, very simple. All you need to do is take a little bit of time and effort to cut 2 layers of each of the dies. Look at this. I mean, this is 1 layer, this is 2 layers. You can see the thickness of the die cuts there, the depth and the contrast that you've got by just adding an extra couple of layers into this one. is so worth the effort. It looks so much more dimensional, and that is really going to stand up much more on your project. Guys, when you are putting these layers together, it's really important that you do not use pattern paper for all of your layers. I wouldn't personally even use it for one of your layers, particularly if it's an intricate design, but I'll show you that with this particular butterfly die. What happens when you start to layer up? This one doesn't look too bad, although you're sort of missing the actual design of the die cut because the dark and the light areas of the paper is just sort of hiding where the shape is. And then this one, even more intricate when it's placed on top. Look, you just lose everything. To be honest, if I'm going to use any pattern paper with a die cut like this, any sort of intricate die cut, in fact, this is as detailed a pattern paper as I would go. Then I'm going to use solid cardstock. So putting that over the top, you can really clearly see the defined borders, and then this one over the top as well. Again, you can see every element there. Look at the difference between the two. How much more does that stand out?
You know, when sometimes it's an intricate die and you miss a little bit from the middle and you need to really carefully kind of position that back into the die, and you know it's going to move when you run it back through again to cut it fully. This is going to help you. So make sure you've kept the waist. So what I'm going to do is position my die cut back into the waist there, and it should all slot in really nicely. Take yourself a piece of low tack tape just across the back there, hold it in place. Then we can put our die on top. Now if you give this a wiggle, that should then slot back in place where it needs to be. Nothing's going to move, so you can go ahead and die cut this. You can put your metal shims in, you can turn it if you want to and get the perfect cut without accidentally cutting any of the little ends off.
Ideally, you want to place your dies so that the roller is only going over 1 or 2 dies at a time. But this isn't always possible because of the size of the dies. So when we do this, instead, I'm going to just stagger these dies, and I'm going to try to make sure as much as possible, and it doesn't matter if a little bit of the waste cardstock is overlapping the die cutting plate. I'm going to make sure as much as possible that the roller is only touching one part of the die at any time. So these stamen, rather than putting them all together this way, I'm going to turn them so that the roller is concentrating on one at a time. Just check the reverse of your die cuts too, because if you see any ghosting, then you need to run that particular die through again, and this is why it's really important to tape your dies down. Now, another tip for you is when a stamp is brand new, as mine is here, I like to prepare it, and I like to do that by taking the coating off that is on the stamp through the manufacturing process. Now, you only need to do this once, and the easiest and really the least expensive way of doing this is simply by using a pencil eraser. I've got one of these ones that are quite large and flat, and I just rub the flat surface over the design just back and forth as if I'm trying to erase pencil marks from it, and do it gently, and then make sure you brush away any of the residue that's come away from the eraser. That is going to leave you with more of a matte surface. You'll be able to feel that straight away. Then I like to go in with a clear ink before I put my coloured ink on top. So something like an embossing ink, just tapping a little over the surface. This is also going to help your ink to stick to your stamp. And then I go in straight away with my black ink or whatever colour ink you want to use. Now, I'm not pressing into the stamp. If I was pressing into the stamp, I'd be squishing ink into all the detail where I don't actually want it. See there, I've got a perfectly detailed and clear image. I'm going to show you how you can easily blend your inks onto your stamp so that you're getting multicoloured stamping in just one impression. Now, usually, of course, we would take our ink pad directly to our stamp, and you can do that, but you're going to get, first of all, harsh straight lines where the edges of the ink pad are, but you're also not going to be accurate where you're applying colour to small areas. So I might go in with a few places with my pink, just like so, just to get some base colour down. But then I'm going to go in with my brush, and I'm going to take that colour up to the edge of each petal in a dabbing motion. And at the same time as I'm doing this, I'm also then blending out those strong straight lines that I've just placed down. And I'm going to go in with my green now, and I'm not going to be putting this direct to my stamp because the areas are much too small. I'm looking at this leaf here and a few leaves around here, and then the stems for each of the florals. Now I'm also using water reactive inks, and this means that I can now mist my ink with a little bit of water, not much at all, and this is going to also help the blending when stamping. So just pressing this down now into my cardstock, and there I've got my beautiful ombre image. And as you can see with this stamped image of the same, we've just added the outline and the colouring is absolutely perfect. Now I absolutely love to use black cardstock, navy cardstock, burgundy cardstock, but then I find stamping onto it can be particularly difficult if I don't have some really good pigment inks. So looking at the dye inks that I have chosen, when I put them onto the navy cardstock that I'm going to use, as you can see, really can't see the colour at all. It just soaks in, and that is not going to stand out as a beautiful stamped image. So we're going to really enhance these by doing another step first. So now I'm going to take a piece of resistant material, and this is just a piece of acetate, and I've got some white paint. Now the brand is irrelevant, it's white acrylic paint, so it's thicker than watercolour. It's not going to soak into your paper, it's going to sit on top, leaving you a lovely opaque colour. So white, or certainly as light as you can find, and a few drops on my mat. Now I'm going to take a small brayer. I prefer to work with a smaller brayer than a larger one. It's a little more precise. I get less on the rest of my stamping platform as well. And I'm just going to take a little bit of that paint, and then away from that blob I'm going to smear that so that it's a really thin coating on my brayer, and bring this over to my stamp and start rolling it on. The reason I'm using a brayer is because it's a flat surface, so I'm not going to get any excess paint down into the parts of the stamp where I don't want it. And then I'm going to press that into my blue cardstock and make sure that I'm getting a really good impression with this. So lift that away, and now we need to make sure that everything has stamped. Now this particular stamp does always look odd when it's just stamped in one colour, because we have got the half tone effect here, so there's some areas that are missing. I'm going to now first of all give this a quick wipe to take the excess off. Then I'm going to thoroughly soak the stamp in water and leave that to sit for a moment. This is going to water down any paint that's in the grooves and the bumps of the stamp itself. So I'm going to reposition my stamp. It's very, very easy for you to see exactly where you're stamping. So now to apply my ink, I'm going to go with a Distress Ink Peacock Feathers, and then I'm going to take peeled paint, which is a green, and I'm going to take a stencil brush, and I'm going to dab this green over where the stems are and where any of the leaves are. Once you've covered that, you can first of all try stamping just as it is, and then if you find that colour isn't quite enough, watery enough or deep enough, you can then spritz a very light mist of water if you need and try again. But looking through this, I think this is going to be quite good. So we can see there how much bolder that colour really is. So that's just one layer of the colour, and if we compare that to the inks that I swatched before, you can see how much brighter that is. Now to simply add over the top the die cut from the set, and there you can really see how well those highlights and those shadows work on that stamp, and how beautiful and bright the colour is coming through.
First one. Now there are lots of beautiful embossing folders on the market, but maybe you've been gifted some and you don't have a die cutting machine, or perhaps you absolutely love yours but you don't want to get your die cutting machine out and you just want to emboss a tiny little bit. Well, there are ways around this. So I'm going to show you the first one, and that's to just simply use pressure with something like a rolling pin. So I'm going to place some cardstock or paper. Ideally you want to go for a lightweight paper, because if it's cardstock you're going to need more pressure, which without a machine you're going to struggle to do. I'm going to use a rolling pin from the kitchen, and I'm just going to press over this. Like I say, a lightweight paper is ideal. So let's see if we can see the emboss. So obviously the emboss is going to be lighter. It's not going to be as deep unless you're super strong, of course. But this is still able to then be inked. You can use your spritzes on it and you can really show up the detail still. Now another way to use your embossing folders that doesn't take much pressure at all is to simply ink them. I'd always suggest inking both sides of the folder. So I'm going to take a water-based ink and just smear it over the side where you can see the detail, and then again the side that highlights the background of your image. So just placing my paper inside there carefully and pressing down. Now you're not going to get the image that you can see here, but you are going to get another beautiful image. I'll show you in just a second, but I'm just using my fingers to squeeze between the two. Now, just so you know, this is not really going to work with 3D embossing folders. There's so many layers, your ink's only ever going to touch the very top one of those unless you really apply lots of ink into the grooves and then, of course, lots of pressure, which is what we're saying we don't have. So squeezing around all the detail and then reveal. So on one side, we have this beautiful image. That's the background inking. And on the other side, we have similar but not quite the same. As you can see, the background is perfectly clear and we've really picked out the detail. Stenciling colours onto dark colours. So sometimes you may find that your ink blending through a stencil onto a dark colour isn't as vibrant as you expect it to be, even if you've used a pigment ink. So to make the stencil really stand out, what we're going to do is apply a white layer first and then put our colours over the top. I'm going to do this with texture paste, but I'd always recommend, first of all, you spritz the back of your stencil with something like a repositionable spray or a stencil glue. Once your stencil is firmly secured down, you can apply a texture paste. Now I would go for a smooth paste, not one with a grit, and one that is opaque white, not a transparent one or even another coloured one. Definitely white is the best colour for you to then show up your inks afterwards nice and bright and bold. You want to place your stencil back over the top of the design once it's completely dry, and now you can do your ink blending. Now you can layer your inks, you can mix them, and you can use the white underneath to create highlights. And as you can see, we've got beautiful bold colour on top of the black cardstock. There we have gone and ink blended a background or a panel. Then we've stamped on it with our clear embossing ink, put the powder on, and the powder has stuck everywhere. So I'm going to show you how to avoid that, but most importantly, if you do it because you just don't expect the ink to take quite so long to dry, how to fix it. So first of all, prevention is always going to be better than cure. So once you've ink blended your panel, you may have used your heat gun on it to warm it up and hopefully fully dry it. Take an embossing powder. Now take one that's going to be nice and contrasting against your background, and spread it all over the area that you're going to place it when you come to do your embossing. Now once that's fully dry and you can tap this off easily, then you know that you can go ahead and do your stamping and of course then do your heat embossing without any little specks flying anywhere. But sometimes we just don't think ahead. So what do you do if it's too late, you've stamped your image and then put your embossing on? All I'm going to do is set this aside. I'm going to come back to that in about 10 minutes, tap the back and see if any more powder comes off. Okay, so let's give this a bit more of a flick. There, perfect. All I've done is allowed that ink to dry. I'd like to talk to you today about your die cutting plates warping. So this happens on most die cutting machines, but I have got a few tips to help you prevent it. So my first tip is to ensure you are using the correct plate combination for the correct pressure, because I'm going to show you now an example of what happens when you use incorrect pressure. Now we all know it is occasionally going to happen, particularly if you've had a difficult die and you have had to add additional pressure for some reason. So my tip here is to, each time you run your plates through, turn your top plate over so that if you do have any curve, it's then facing down into the machine and into the plates. And you can do this each and every time you run your plates through.
Effect. Now we're only going to be using 2 products for this on top of our cardstock. Now the more cracks you want, the bigger you want your cracks, the thicker you're going to want your glue spread out. So I've really put quite a lot on here, more so you can really see the effect. Now this is the bit that I don't enjoy so much, and it's simply waiting for this to dry. Now that has just started to dry enough so that when I apply my paint, it's not all going to lift up. You are going to get some movement in the paint underneath unless you've let it thoroughly dry. Now, if you let it thoroughly dry, you will still get a crackle effect, but I find the better effect is if you still leave it so it's tacky, so that maybe there's a slight skin on it, but the underneath is still wet. Now I'm going to go in with my acrylic paint. I've made sure I've shaken this so that it's all mixed up and I don't get that watery glute coming out first. You want to be aware of your brush strokes as well, because those brush strokes are really going to be emphasized once we start drying this paint. So just putting my phone on here and leaving it for a few minutes, filming it. I've obviously sped this up for you. And then I started going in with my heat gun and very lightly from a distance, just warming the air around the paint to make everything start to dry and crackle. You can see those large cracks already starting to come into place. Now you can see the difference there, a thicker layer and a thinner layer. In reality, the thickness of those layers wasn't hugely different, so definitely have a play and get a feel for the style of crackles that you enjoy using.